I had never been the kind of person to let others walk all over me, but nothing could have prepared me for the level of entitlement I was about to face. It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the sun peeked over the trees just right, casting golden light over my property. I had just stepped outside, coffee in hand, taking in the peaceful morning air when I saw her. A woman marching up my driveway like she owned the place, her perfectly manicured nails clutching a clipboard, her expression set in the kind of smugness that made my stomach turn. I had seen her before, always strutting around the neighborhood like a self-appointed queen, handing out notices, dictating what colors people could paint their doors, and making life miserable for anyone who dared to defy her. But I had never expected her to be standing on my land, looking at me like I was some kind of trespasser. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. Excuse me, she barked before I could even open my mouth. You need to remove that vehicle from your driveway immediately. Her voice was sharp, laced with authority she had no right to wield. She pointed to my truck, a perfectly functional one I had parked there for months without issue. And while you're at it, those weeds near your fence need to be taken care of. We have standards in this community. I blinked at her, taking a slow sip of my coffee before answering. I'm sorry, who are you? The woman scoffed, clutching her clipboard even tighter. I'm Karen, the HOA president. She said it like it was supposed to mean something to me, like her words carried the weight of law. I sent you several notices, but you've been ignoring them. If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate this further. I sighed, already feeling my patience thinning. Karen, I don't know what notices you're talking about, but I'm not part of the HOA. I own this land outright, and your little rules don't apply to me. For a moment, she just stared at me, blinking rapidly like I had spoken in a foreign language. Then, she let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, you're one of those people. Think you're special because you opted out? That doesn't mean you get to just ignore the rules. This is a community, and we have guidelines for a reason. If you don't want to be part of the HOA, that's fine, but you still have to maintain your property to our standards. I exhaled sharply, gripping my coffee mug a little tighter. Karen, let me make something crystal clear. I am not part of your HOA. I never sign any agreements, and I legally have no obligation to follow your rules. So, unless you have an actual legal reason to be on my property, I suggest you turn around and walk away. Her face twitched, the smugness slipping for just a second before it was replaced with something colder. Oh, we'll see about that, she snapped. I have connections with the city. You can't just ignore community regulations. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to report you for code violations. It won't be long before the city forces you to comply. I chuckled, shaking my head. Report me for what, exactly? Having a truck in my driveway, living on my own land? You don't have a leg to stand on, Karen. And if you try anything, I'll be the one making the calls. Her jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around the clipboard so hard I thought she might snap it in half. You think you're untouchable, don't you? She hissed. You think you can just do whatever you want, but this community won't tolerate people like you. I will make sure you regret this. With that, she turned on her heel and stomped away, her ridiculous high heels clicking against the pavement as she disappeared down the street. I watched her go, shaking my head, knowing full well that this wasn't the end of it. People like Karen didn't take no for an answer. She was the type to escalate, to push, to scheme until she got what she wanted. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got the first official notice, an aggressive, printed letter stuffed into my mailbox, full of bogus claims about non-compliance and veiled threats about further action if I didn't meet the HOA's demands. I wasn't the least bit worried. The letter was nothing more than an intimidation tactic, an attempt to make me back down before things got messy. But Karen had made a mistake. She assumed I was like the others, too scared or exhausted to fight back. She thought she could pressure me into submission. She had no idea that I was ready for war. Karen's threats lingered in my mind long after she stormed off that day, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement like a warning shot. I had dealt with entitled people before, but there was something particularly relentless about her. The way she spoke as if she had the final say in everything, as if the entire neighborhood was hers to command. I had no doubt she was already scheming, working through whatever underhanded tactics she could use to make my life miserable. The first sign that she wasn't letting this go came just 2 days later. I stepped outside that morning, coffee in hand, only to find a bright yellow envelope taped aggressively to my front door. The HOA's official letterhead was stamped across the top, the words "Final Notice of Noncompliance" typed in bold beneath it. I ripped it open and scanned the contents, my eyes narrowing at the ridiculous list of infractions. Unauthorized vehicle storage, unapproved landscaping, failure to maintain visual aesthetic consistency with the community. I actually let out a laugh at that last one. Visual aesthetic consistency? Was she seriously trying to fine me for not decorating my home in the exact bland way she preferred? But what caught my eye the most was a demand for immediate payment. $3,000 in fines due within 7 days. I shook my head, exhaling sharply as I crumpled the letter in my fist. Karen was trying to bully me, plain and simple. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't the kind of person who caved under pressure. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. I spent the next hour gathering every legal document I had on my property. Purchase agreements, zoning permits, even a printed copy of the original neighborhood development plan. Nowhere did it state that my land fell under the HOA's jurisdiction. Karen was bluffing, hoping I'd be too intimidated to call her on it. But I had no intention of backing down. When I left my house that afternoon, I noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk a few houses down, deep in conversation with one of the other board members. The moment she saw me, her lips curled into a smug little smirk, like she had already won. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but I could feel her eyes on me the entire time I walked to my truck. By the time I returned home later that evening, the harassment had escalated. This time, instead of just another letter, there was a full-fledged violation notice stuck to a bright orange stake planted firmly in my front yard. It was large enough for the entire neighborhood to see, a public declaration that I was in serious breach of community regulations. My jaw tightened as I ripped it free, my patience running razor thin. It wasn't just about some petty fines anymore. Karen wanted to humiliate me, to turn my own neighbors against me, so that I had no choice but to submit. But she had underestimated me in a way that was going to cost her dearly. I had spent years dealing with bureaucratic nonsense, navigating corporate red tape, and working around people who thrived on making things difficult for others. Karen thought she could push me around with a few official-looking documents and some well-placed threats. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I decided it was time for a confrontation. Not the kind where I storm over to her house and start yelling, but something far more effective. I took every single piece of evidence I had collected, organized it into a neat little folder, and headed straight for City Hall. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was going to show her exactly how badly she had miscalculated. It took a little patience, but eventually I got to speak with someone who actually had authority over zoning and property laws. I laid everything out in front of them, from the false fines to the unauthorized notices, and I watched as their expression darkened the more they read. The official glanced up at me, their tone shifting from polite professionalism to something sharper, more serious. "You're right," they admitted. "Your property was never included in the HOA's jurisdiction. They have no legal grounds to fine you, and they certainly can't enforce any of these violations." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. So what happens now? The official tapped their pen against the desk thoughtfully. Well, we'll have to investigate how these fines were processed in the first place. If they've been issuing fraudulent notices, that's a major problem. That was exactly what I had been hoping to hear. I left City Hall feeling lighter than I had in days, armed with the knowledge that Karen had just walked herself straight into a legal mess of her own making. But I wasn't about to just sit back and wait for things to unfold. The moment I got home, I went straight to my computer and drafted up my own letter. This one a formal cease and desist, warning Karen and the HOA that any further attempts to enforce their fraudulent policies on my property would result in immediate legal action. I printed out copies, mailed one directly to the HOA's official address, and personally delivered another straight to Karen's doorstep. When she answered the door, her face twisted and barely contained irritation, but there was a flicker of uncertainty behind her eyes when she saw the document in my hand. "What is this?" she demanded. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "A legal notice," I replied, handing it to her. "Your little scam ends here, Karen. The city knows what you've been up to. I'd suggest you start preparing for some real consequences." She snatched the paper from me, scanning it quickly, and I saw the exact moment the reality of the situation hit her. For the first time since this ridiculous war had started, she looked nervous. "You can't do this," she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had before. "Oh, I can," I assured her, "and I already have." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing frozen in her doorway, gripping the paper so tightly her knuckles went white. I knew this wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time, I was the one holding the upper hand. The silence that followed my warning to Karen was almost too good to be true. For the first time since this ridiculous ordeal had begun, there were no new notices stuffed into my mailbox, no aggressive letters taped to my door, no HOA goons loitering around my property pretending to inspect violations that didn't exist. But I knew better than to assume she had given up. People like Karen didn't just back down, especially when their ego was on the line. She had spent too long lording over this neighborhood, too long believing she was untouchable. The look on her face when I handed her that cease and desist had been one of pure shock, but I had also seen something else, anger. The kind of anger that didn't fade, the kind that festered, and I was right to be wary. 3 days later, I stepped outside to find something new waiting for me, a formal complaint from the city regarding multiple ongoing violations reported by the HOA. I unfolded the letter, skimming through the exaggerated claims. Excessive noise complaints, improper disposal of waste, unauthorized home modifications. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head at the sheer desperation. Karen had clearly realized that she couldn't find me directly, so she had decided to weaponize the city against me instead. It was a weak attempt, though, and one that reeked of someone grasping at straws. If she thought I was just going to sit back and let her drag this out, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure she regretted ever coming after me. I took the complaint straight to the city office, making sure to speak to the same official I had met with before. They barely glanced at the paper before sighing, rubbing their temples like they were already exhausted with this nonsense. "I had a feeling this was coming," they admitted, flipping through their notes from our previous conversation. "We've already flagged your property as outside the HOA's jurisdiction, which means these complaints are nothing more than a nuisance tactic. Can she actually get me in trouble for any of this?" I asked, even though I already suspected the answer. The officials shook their head. "Not unless there's legitimate proof, which, from the looks of it, she doesn't have. We'll go through the formal process, but I can tell you right now, this isn't going anywhere." That was all I needed to hear. I left the office with a renewed sense of determination, knowing I had to take things a step further. If Karen wanted to escalate this into an all-out war, I was going to end it in a way she wouldn't see coming. I started by compiling every single complaint letter and fine she had sent my way, organizing them into a neat little folder. Then I began reaching out to other homeowners in the neighborhood, particularly those who had voiced frustrations about the HOA in the past. It didn't take long to realize that I wasn't the only one Karen had been harassing. She had been running the HOA like her own personal kingdom, bullying people into compliance with threats, excessive fines, and outright lies. One neighbor had been forced to repaint their house twice because she kept claiming the color didn't fit the community aesthetic. Another had been fined hundreds of dollars for keeping their trash bins out too long. despite following the same schedule as everyone else. The more stories I heard, the clearer it became. Karen had been abusing her position for years, and no one had ever dared to challenge her. Until now. The final piece of my plan came together when I dug a little deeper into the HOA's financial records. Public records revealed something interesting. Under Karen's leadership, there had been multiple misappropriations of HOA funds. Money that was supposed to be used for community maintenance had instead gone toward things like expensive dinners, personal renovations on Karen's own property, and vague expenses with no real explanation. It was the kind of evidence that could ruin her, and I knew exactly what to do with it. I drafted a formal complaint, backed by multiple neighbors who had grown tired of Karen's reign, and submitted it directly to the city's housing board. But I didn't stop there. I made sure to send a copy to every HOA member, including a few who had been on the board but clearly hadn't been aware of what Karen had been up to. The moment those papers landed in their hands, Karen's carefully built empire started to crumble. That night, as I sat on my porch, sipping a well-earned drink, I saw her again. She was pacing in front of her house, phone pressed tightly to her ear, her free hand gesturing wildly as she spoke. Even from a distance, I could see the panic in her movements, the frantic way she kept glancing toward my house. She had finally realized what was happening. The walls were closing in, and this time, there was no escape. I smiled to myself, watching as she disappeared back inside. She had started this worth thinking she could bully me into submission. But now, she was the one scrambling, desperate to hold on to the power she had abused for far too long. And the best part, the real consequences hadn't even hit her yet. That was still to come. Karen's downfall didn't happen all at once, but rather in a series of humiliating, devastating blows that left her scrambling to hold on to the power she had wielded so recklessly. The first sign that her world was starting to collapse came just a few days after I had sent out my formal complaint against her. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers, and even those who had once blindly followed her were starting to question her authority. People began talking, sharing their own experiences, and realizing that they weren't alone in their frustrations. It was almost amusing to watch the shift unfold. Just a week ago, Karen had been strutting through the streets, clipboard in hand, dictating which shades of beige were acceptable for front doors and demanding compliance from everyone in sight. Now, she was avoiding eye contact, her movements sharper, more rushed, as if she could feel the neighborhood turning against her. It wasn't long before the HOA board called an emergency meeting, one that Karen had clearly not been expecting. I wasn't a member of the HOA, so I had no intention of attending, but that didn't stop half the neighborhood from filling me in afterward. Apparently, the financial discrepancies I had exposed had been the final straw for many of the board members. While some had been willing to overlook her heavy-handed tactics, they weren't about to risk legal trouble over misappropriated funds. The meeting had been tense, with Karen doing everything in her power to deflect, deny, and shift blame. She accused the board of betrayal, claimed that I was orchestrating a smear campaign, and even had the audacity to suggest that I had somehow fabricated the records. But the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the bank statements. The moment someone suggested bringing in an external auditor, Karen's confidence shattered. She started backpedaling, trying to downplay the situation, offering weak justifications for every questionable transaction. But the damage was done. 2 days later, an official notice went out to the entire community. Effective immediately, Karen was being removed as HOA president. The board had voted to conduct a full financial review, and in the meantime, all fines issued under her authority were being put under review. The news spread like wildfire, and by the end of the day, the smug, overbearing woman who had once controlled the neighborhood with an iron fist had been completely stripped of her power. The most satisfying part? She knew exactly who had started the fire that burned her little empire to the ground. I expected her to confront me, to show up on my doorstep one last time in a desperate attempt to regain control. But she didn't. Instead, she vanished from sight, retreating into the walls of her house like a wounded animal. No more threats, no more notices, no more smug glances in my direction. It was almost disappointing, in a way. After everything, I had thought she would at least try to go out with a fight. But then, just as I was starting to think that she had finally learned her lesson, something happened that made me realize she wasn't done causing trouble just yet. Late one night, I was sitting in my living room when I heard the sound of tires screeching down the street. A moment later, there was a loud, sharp crack, like something hard colliding with wood. I jumped up and rushed outside, just in time to see the taillights of a car speeding away down the road. My mailbox was in pieces, shattered across my driveway, the post splintered at the base. At first, I thought it might have been an accident, maybe some reckless teenager messing around, but then I spotted something lying among the wreckage. A single sheet of paper, crumpled and smeared with dirt. I picked it up, unfolding it slowly, and felt my lips twitch into a grin. It was a final notice from the HOA, one of the very same fraudulent violation letters Karen had been stuffing into my mailbox weeks ago. The message was clear. This was her last act of defiance, a childish attempt at revenge now that she had lost everything. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head as I tossed the paper into the trash. It was pathetic, really. After everything she had done, after all the lies, the harassment, and the manipulation, this was all she had left. A petty, meaningless act of vandalism. I could have reported it, could have taken it as far as I wanted, but I didn't bother. Karen was already defeated. She had lost her position, her influence, and most importantly, the fear she had relied on to control everyone around her. The neighborhood had seen her for who she really was, and no amount of broken mailboxes was going to change that. The next morning, I replaced the mailbox with a sturdier one, set in concrete, the kind that could take a direct hit without even wobbling. It was a small act of defiance, a final nail in the coffin of the war she had started. And just like that, life returned to normal. The neighborhood was quieter, more relaxed, almost as if a weight had been lifted. People no longer walked on eggshells, worried about arbitrary fines or sudden rule changes. Without Karen, the HOA had become what it was always supposed to be, a group meant to support the community, not terrorize it. A few weeks later, I saw a moving truck parked outside Karen's house. She stood by the front steps, watching as her belongings were loaded up, her posture stiff, her face blank. I thought about saying something, offering some final words of victory, but I didn't need to. She already knew. Instead, I simply gave her a nod as I walked past, the kind of nod that said, I won. She didn't respond, just turned away and disappeared inside. By the next morning, she was gone, and with her, the last traces of the tyranny she had tried to impose on me. It was over, and I had won.